So far we've heard about, we've debated the merits of rating systems and accreditation certification systems. We've talked about how to develop standards for them and how metrics have been developed in other fields and what we might be able to learn and pull from that for thinking about a global health label. We've also talked about whether these systems should be deliberative and representative and when and how. And now we want to conclude with considerations on how to protect the integrity of these systems. So things like how to avoid accreditation systems becoming mere window dressing or being something that you can just buy. How can we reduce instances of gaming or framing or capture? So to start off the conversation, we have Jonathan Marks. Jonathan is the director of the bioethics program at Penn State. He's also a network fellow at the Edmund J. Safra Center for Ethics.
Thank you, Jennifer, and I just want to thank Jennifer and Nia for inviting me to participate in what I think has been a really fascinating day. And I'd like to thank you for staying around for the final session. You deserve credit for that. So I want to express, and I decided not to produce PowerPoints because I thought there was going to be a lot said today to which I would want to respond by the time we got to 4:45. And indeed, that is exactly how I feel. It's been a really terrific set of presentations. And what I'm going to do in response is express, I think, what might be characterized best as some systemic ethical concerns about some of the proposals on the table today. And in fact, one of them is sort of maybe unintentionally represented by the graphic on the screen, because although the title of the symposium is Global Health, a Company's Global Health Footprint, all we're getting is 5 little toe prints because there's some strange sock on the foot. And indeed, that mirrors, I think, some of the concerns expressed earlier on during the day about what exactly gets measured and what goes into the calculation or the production of the toe print or footprint. So I want to pick up on a few themes today. The first actually has to do with a theme that arose from this morning's presentations and on which I briefly commented, which is a concern that I have about halo effects resulting from the representation of impacts on labeling of whether it be pharmaceuticals or indeed closer to my own heart questions of food labeling. So what we do know from quite a bit of the research is that consumers are often misled by food labeling. They don't often have a rich understanding, and so when they see a food package that says, I'll give you an example of one that struck me as being highly problematic, a packet of nuts that said, actually it was a packet of pistachios that said cholesterol free. Right, taking advantage of the fact that what most people don't understand is that what one cares about is serum cholesterol. And in fact, the cholesterol we get in our diet is mainly from eggs and meat, but indeed serum cholesterol is what we're also concerned about. And so that isn't dependent solely on meat and dairy, and so meat and eggs rather. And so people were sort of persuaded to think that there was something especially good about nuts. Now, I don't have a problem with people eating nuts, but what we know from other labeling is that it can have a somewhat misleading and deceptive effect. And more importantly, it can lead to unhealthy consumer behaviors. So basically, half of the food in our supermarkets today is promoted for its nutritional and health benefits above and beyond basic nutrition, but half of those foods, again, are high in salt, fat, sugar, or a combination of all three. So you add to that some kind of additional label that purports to represent the global impact of the manufacturer, as we saw in the packaging this morning for Advil, and that potentially adds another layer of a halo effect that one would be concerned about. And I noticed that just in the last panel, somebody made a comment about Subway being better than McDonald's. So this is another fascinating piece of research. I think it's Chandan and Wansink who looked at the impact of the marketing of Subway foods as healthy. So the average, when they conducted a study, the average consumer looked at a 1,000-calorie McDonald's meal and assessed on average it was 740 calories. So they were discounting. But because Subway promotes its food as healthy, they looked at an average 1,000-calorie meal and assessed the caloric content as being in the 500-calorie range. And what that had, the effect that had, incidentally, was also to lead people to order higher calorie, high fat desserts and or high calorie beverages. So health halos can lead to unhealthy behaviors on the part of consumers. So if you had a food company which was doing great things in some other part of the world, sub-Saharan Africa, as indeed some major food corporations are doing right now, and they get credit for that and a logo they can put on their packaging, you may in turn be inducing people in this country to pursue unhealthy behaviors. So that for me is a real problem. And I would say, by the way, that fast food chains have also recognized the value of having healthy options. But if you look at the menu items that get promoted, they're not the healthy ones necessarily. And so they get credit for having healthy options, but all the featured items tend to be the unhealthier ones, and that too has an impact on behavior. So I am concerned about halo effects as a result of giving people logos they can put on packaging which represent in some way their global health impact. The other concern, of course, is one which is highlighted by Jennifer herself this morning, which is the question of fees. So if a rating agency is getting fees from the company whose product is being rated, that's problematic. In the food world, people have been very critical of the American Heart Association, which makes several $1,000s every time it gives a heart check to a food manufacturer, and many food manufacturers are paying several hundreds of thousands of dollars to the American Heart Association for a range of products. So there's clearly a conflict of interest there. And of course, what we know from the financial sector is where you have multiple rating agencies who are deriving fees, you get competition between the rating agencies. In the financial sector, it was Moody's, Fitch, Standard & Poor. And so each knew that if they didn't give a AAA rating to a product or a commercial entity, then they would go somewhere else. So the fees are a real problem. I would say just in the last couple of minutes something about the structural incentives. So we need to think, of course, about what can be measured and what can't. And the danger is that we focus too much on the things that can be measured, and we focus on short-term returns. And so the more complex problems, the solutions for which require much more long-term investment, and the outcome of which is less measurable, may get neglected if we focus on the short-term and the measurable. And that also, in turn, may lead to incentives to game the system. I'll just say a couple of other things very briefly. I have written, as part of the Safra Center's working paper series, a paper on public-private partnerships. And I think when you're talking about global health and corporations, one should also recognize it's in the larger context of a lot of public-private partnerships related to improving global health. And those partnerships have some effects that we might want to be concerned about. One is framing effects. So problems get framed in a particular way which is compatible with the interests of industry. And sometimes, I mean, in the US, there's a good example of this. Obesity is so often characterized as a question of individual behavior rather than social and environmental influences on health. It also tends to lead to solutions that are technological and readily commercializable. And so what you often see, again, when you have industry working in that in the context of global health, you're going to see these kinds of solutions. And it can have a distorting effect on the agendas and priorities of public bodies at the international level as well as the local level. So going after the low-hanging fruit is very tempting, but if going after the low-hanging fruit also leads one to neglect the rather more difficult to reach fruit, but fruit that is worth aiming for, that is something we should be concerned about. And one of my own concerns is, you know, we have a whole host of complex global health issues, and if we're building a structural response based on private sector activity and private sector accreditation or ratings, then what that means is a whole host, well, it means a couple of things. First, it sort of diffuses support for public funding for global health because, well, the private sector is doing it. And secondly, what it leads to is the neglect of a range of potential solutions that we would look at if that we aren't looking at, but that we should look at. And the reason why we don't look at them is because they're not consonant with the interests of the private sector. So those are some of the systemic concerns I have. And one thing I'll say sort of in closing is that, I do have a sort of skepticism about the role of industry in public health, and I derive that not solely from my skeptical nature, but also from the comments of people who've been on the inside of industry. And one that struck me quite poignantly was a comment by Michael Mudd, who's the former executive vice president of corporate affairs at Kraft Foods, who said, next time you hear of a big food or beverage company sponsoring an after-school activity program in your community, or you might expand that with many other examples at the global level, you can be sure they'll say it's to show our company's concern for our kids' health, or whatever it may be. But the real intent is to look angelic while making consumers feel good about the brand and drawing attention away from the unhealthful nature of the company's products. Posing for holy cards, as one of my colleagues put it. And so, I do have a deep concern about the sort of gaming and manipulation of the system. So I'm not because I don't have time to propose solutions to those problems, I want to put those on the table and hope that my fellow panelists are going to come up with some wonderful ways to address them in their comments. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Jonathan. So next we have Reshma, I hope I pronounced this correctly, Ramachandran. Great. So she's a student at Brown Medical School and here at Harvard Kennedy School, and she's actively involved in the American Medical Student Association Farm-Free Scorecard, which is the subject of her presentation.
All right, good evening, everyone. My name is Reshma. So I'm going to be talking about the AMSA Farm-Free Scorecard. The AMSA Farm-Free Scorecard came out of the Farm-Free campaign, which actually started in 2002 as a result of medical students here at Harvard Medical School and across medical schools around the country being very concerned that their medical education was being too influenced by industry and not evidence-based. So out of that campaign, which initially started as educational talks looking at the role of industry in not only medical education as well as prescribing behavior, but also clinical research, students decided to create a quantitative scorecard to look at conflict of interest policies that medical schools develop and assess them on a year-to-year basis. All right, and first, as a disclosure slide, I have no financial relationships with a commercial entity producing healthcare-related products or services, but the materials from this talk and a lot of the work that I've done in the past 4 or 5 years has been funded through the State Attorney General Consumer and Prescriber Education Grant, which was funded by the multi-state settlement of consumer fraud claims regarding the marketing of the prescription drug Neurontin. Some of you might have seen the case. The decision was in 2004, and there was certain hundreds of millions of dollars due to misleading marketing that led to the creation of this grant. All right, so this is the AMSA Farm-Free Scorecards map with the various medical schools that are highlighted by the dots. The different colors reflect a letter grade that is assigned to the schools once we figure out once the analysts and the Farm-Free Scorecard team come together to determine what the score for their school's conflict of interest policies are. You can see here that a lot of the schools actually do have fairly strong conflict of interest policies as a result of 2013. So a lot of schools have A's and B's, but there are some good changes that we're actually implementing right now in terms of assessing not only medical schools, but teaching hospitals as well. All right, so first of all, why do we need a scorecard in the first place? Why do we need to look at medical education in such a way? And this is a little bit of an outdated graph, but kind of the one takeaway I want to put out here is that the amount of money that has been spent on by pharmaceutical companies on marketing activity has been largely tailored towards healthcare professionals. You can see in the graph here that the amount of money that's given for journal advertisements, direct-to-consumer advertising, meetings and events has increased somewhat over the past years, but the major increase has been specifically academic detailing to healthcare professionals. professionals. And this happens in a variety of ways, starting in clinical training. In fact, I've been invited to various events, both informally and formally, by pharmaceutical companies, in the clinic, at my medical school, through emails, through other colleagues of mine, by my preceptors, and this happens to my attendings as well, in journals, in clinics, through their patients, at educational events, at conferences. There is a lot of detailing that is funded by pharmaceutical companies that occurs. And assessing the influence and the role of that on prescribing behavior and also medical education is really, really, really important, because there's been many studies in the early 2000s that have shown a correlation between the amount of promotional spending and changes in prescribing behavior. And I'll actually show some of these right now. So here, this is actually a study that was done by a past Safra fellow, Kirsten Austad, with Aaron Kesselheim, who's a MD-JD at Harvard Medical School at the Department of Pharmacoepidemiology, looking at the role of drug company interactions on medical students. And this was actually good news for us, because it actually showed a dramatic shift from a similar study that was done in 2003. In the study, the results showed that 54% of residents and more than 50% of medical students at different years of training actually reported receiving gifts from pharmaceutical companies. On top of that, a large majority of residents, medical students, also believe that they've received valuable education through the drug company interactions, although 3/4 of them acknowledge that that they had increased bias as a result of any drug company interactions. A similar study in 2003 actually showed that 3/4 of students reported no bias as a result of drug company interactions. So clearly there's just been education, further studies, a lot more importance put on this in medical schools to show that these types of interactions do actually affect medical education as well as prescribing behavior. And in fact, 2 studies that came out last year, one by Joe Ross, the second one actually, and Epstein, who's at Penn State, if I'm not mistaken, University of Pennsylvania, both showed that strong conflict of interest policies actually do have a positive effect on prescribing behavior in choosing drugs that are well established, not newly marketed or brand name to patients. And they looked at specific classes of drugs, which are shown in these results. Don't have a lot of time, so I'm just going to kind of gloss over it. All right. So these are the results from the 2013 scorecard. You can see the grade distribution again. A lot of schools again have A's and B's, and the scorecard methodology was actually developed in 2005, and this was the 5th iteration of the scorecard. So as you can see here, there's been a positive trend, and in fact, we have now 98% of medical schools submitting policies to us on a yearly basis. These are the scores by the various domains. As of last year, actually from 2008 to 2013, we grade schools on 11 specific domains, and these were taken from a 2006 JAMA article by Brennan, which outlined recommendations for academic medical centers. And as you can see here, there's been a positive trend for a lot of the categories in terms of improving their policies. And this has continued, in the recent years, but some domains like sales reps, disclosure, still have schools not performing to the best of their ability. And again, here is the distribution of grade results from 2008, 2013. There's been a positive upstroke of A's and B's over the years. So I'm just going to go into how we're revising the scorecard. So as you can imagine, in the past 5 years, we've received a lot of feedback from medical school deans, from compliance officers, from students, from faculty about the scorecard and how we can make it stronger and better. This past year and a half, I was actually a fellow in DC working full-time on the I'm So Far Free campaign, and was in a methodology task force with Joe Ross and a few other folks from Pew Charitable Trust, where we took the recommendations of these medical school deans that we convened in a meeting, as well as compliance officers, to create a new scorecard that we're going to be implementing and releasing next year. And as you can see here, we expanded the number of domains from 11 domains to 16 domains. And we have refined the methodology from going from initially, which was a 1 to 3 scale, to now a 1 to 5 scale. And this process has been pretty interesting because we're looking at reliability and validity and trying to see the analysts who are actually grading the conflict of interest policies, how we can maximize their inter-rater reliability as well. But it kind of gives you a lesson in terms of, who to bring to the table in terms of developing metrics for conflict of interest policies. One consideration, just I'm going to put out there, is that we convene medical school deans who are very proud of their schools, and they thought they had pretty strong policies. So in fact, a lot of the times when we try to push the standards for some of these domains, they often said, our school has an I model policy across, the scorecard metric and across, the literature. So why should we push for something that might not be attainable? Which is an interesting conflict of interest question in and of itself. Having medical school deans who are going to be submitting a policy, giving us recommendations for what should be in the scorecard. And on top of that, though, we actually consulted with various faculty and folks from groups, professional societies, as well as National Physicians Alliance, Community Catalyst, which is a consumer group, because we realized when teaching hospitals are going to be put on a public website, patients will have access to that to see where their hospital lands in terms of conflict of interest and understand the implications. So that's a kind of a different take to look at the AMSA scorecard as not only an academic tool or a tool to push medical schools or academic medical centers to change, but as a tool for patients to recognize what conflict of interest is really about. So I'm just going to leave that out there as kind of an open-ended question because we're still working through this in the methodology. And if you have any questions, feel free to ask when we have some free time. Thank you very much.
Next, we have Nir Eyal, who needs no introduction, and he'll be talking about 2 ways to guard the guards.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody, for staying here. 3 of the many challenges that we mentioned today in labeling. I'm going to repeat basically points that were made earlier. A bunch of us mentioned that there are just too many labels out there. You go to the supermarket, you're just confused. You don't, by one, do they mean the best or the worst? Green, does that mean about the environment? Does that mean the opposite of red? And it's too much to handle for the consumer and even for some investors, which creates inaction. Some labels reflect low levels of competence on the part of the people who created them. They don't have the mechanism to monitor. They don't come up with the right standards. And finally, what we're talking about now is a third problem, that companies have every incentive to try to tell everybody we are great and to create bogus labels that give them high grades, and I think Jonathan referred to some of those. I'm going to discuss today now what we could do in order to try to identify a core among all these labels out there, a core which is good in terms of not just freedom from conflict of interest, but in additional terms, and signal it out for consumers, for investors, from regulators as the ones to follow. So it will be more manageable, more reliable. But who could do that, if you will? Who is going to guard the guards? I'm going to discuss now 3 different models for trying to address this challenge. One way to address it is to label the labelers. Have labels for labels, and if it takes it, labels for labels for labels, and things of that sort. This can only be part of the solution because the 3 problems we mentioned earlier completely, I think, rear their ugly heads potentially with this. There could also be too many labels of labels of labels. And the fact that something is a label of a label doesn't guarantee that there would be any competence in the creation of that label of labels, and in a way it only kind of creates more trouble if this is our leader now. And finally, the labels of the labels can be also company operations that say the other thing that our company created is a great thing. Of course, we have also been created by the same company. That's not really freeing us from that loop. A second approach is to put at the helm some reputable organization, some organization that we can trust and that the public can trust, and that if this works well, kind of has sort of reliability and kind of accreditation for competence that trickles down. But that's asking a lot of these organizations. John Ruggie mentioned in the video today how much there is by way of companies to regulate out there, to govern out there. Finding for every subfield of sector of industry some expert who would be able to tell us which are the good labels there and which are the bad labels, again, in terms of competence, in terms of freedom from conflicts of interest. Even that is a big task for one organization. I'm going to discuss a third model, which I'm not sure I believe in, but I find it interesting, and we'll see what you think about that. So call it a liquid democracy based, and I'm going to try to explain what this is about, system for crowdsourcing that helps govern this system. In a way, this will also help us address some of the issues about democracy that we mentioned earlier today. So we need to decide which of these three labels in one sector is the best one that we want to canonize and maybe put under some umbrella of the good labels that maybe then we would encourage consumers, investors, and others to look to. So they might actually eventually be able to have, they would go to the supermarket, look for the sign of the umbrella without needing to deal with the different ways of grading and rating of every individual label. But how are we going to do that? Well, imagine that every internet user who opens an account gets one vote. These ballot signs are the one vote per person that each of them has. And they could help us decide on this matter. Now, they would have the prerogative, if they want, simply to elect the label that they find best. But I'm very much hoping that this is not going to be, it's not going to be this direct democracy where they simply decide, because they're in an awful position, actually, awful position to tell which label. These are people from different countries. They are not even experts in that field. If this is a burdensome task for WHO, the individual internet users have no basis for telling those things. But they would have, under liquid democracy, also the prerogative to delegate their votes to another internet user whom they find to be more reliable than they are. For a lot of people out there, that would be maybe a trusted physician, maybe Paul Farmer, Sanjay Gupta, somebody that they feel is really reliable, really not in the business of conflicts of interest, and knows more than they do. Now, that individual user could, if they wanted, so they would now get the votes of a lot of people, they could use it to just vote, but that's actually not an ideal situation either. I'm very much hoping that they would use another prerogative that the system gives them, which is to continue to delegate the vote. So in a liquid democracy, and that's the difference from regular direct democracy, in the liquid democracy, you can delegate any vote that arrives to you to somebody else whom you think is a better expert than you are. So they would potentially delegate the vote to somebody whom they think is an bigger expert than they are. So maybe Paul Farmer, he knows this labeling, this sector what we're talking about is about gas and oil extraction. I'm no expert on pollution or whatever, but I do know that in the public health school, say, there is this department, I'll send it to somebody there. So they increase the reliability, at least in their perception, and then this person can send it to somebody else whom they think is a bigger expert than they are, and that can be sent on and on and on, if necessary, many, many times, until, this is the hope, if this works, until eventually it tends to reach somebody who is indeed the biggest expert out there, at least in their own eyes, and they say, okay, you know, I actually do know a lot about this. I don't need to check too much. This is the good label. And then they will cast their vote. And this label would win if it gets the majority after all of this process. So I don't know what you think about this, but that's basically the thought. There is a computer program that actually manages liquid democracy. It's very sophisticated, and any such platform could use these computer programs that were created by advocates of liquid democracy in Northern Europe. Thank you.
I'm speechless. All right, the next and final presenter is David Vogel. David is a professor at the Haas School of Business in the Department of Political Science at the University of California, Berkeley. And I think he's going to be giving more concluding comments and wrapping up the conference.
The basic point I wish to make is I think there are enormous opportunities to improve the social performance and responsibility of companies in the area of global public health, but I do not think that relying on consumers or labels of products is the way to go. I think there are two basic problems which we've identified with relying on consumers. One is that most of them are indifferent. That is to say, when we think about consumer behavior, most consumers make criteria in terms of their purchasing, in terms of their own self-interest, convenience, price, quality, etc. Relatively little consumer behavior is driven by what we call the warm glow in business schools, which is buying or not buying something for various social criteria or environmental criteria or ethical criteria, which doesn't directly affect the person. So I think, the vision of ethical consumption is a very seductive one. It's very attractive. All of us make these purchasing decisions every day. The idea of mobilizing people and getting them to favor particular products or companies and not disfavor others is a very challenging, exciting notion. The evidence that we have now, it's now been 20, 25 years of this, is it's very thin, it's very uneven, it's very unusual for that behavior to have, for that public-spirited behavior and by consumers to have any impact. The number of socially motivated boycotts or positive impacts is extremely small, and I do not see any evidence that it's going to increase. The second problem with labels and relying on consumers, suggested before here, is that people will rely on them and do the wrong thing. They'll act deceptively. They'll be fooled by these labels. So one problem is they'll ignore them, and the second is they'll distort their behavior. So I think relying on consumers who are so overwhelmed by so much information and marketing, et cetera, is a very frail reed on which to promote and encourage global corporate responsibility. However, I think there are strategies that make a difference. And I think one of the paradoxes in thinking about what's happened to corporate social responsibility over the last 15, 20 years is that while there's little evidence that it's been driven by consumers, there's a lot of evidence that a lot of corporations have changed and improved their behavior. And we've talked about a lot of the reasons for that. There's been increased pressure for disclosure. Many industries have developed codes of conduct. We have many standards for corporate performance. We have ratings of corporate performance, which are not meant for consumers, but for investors or for other particular constituencies. We have NGOs who follow corporate behavior and monitor it. We have people who expose what companies are doing. We have many ethical investment funds. Ms. Lindbergh in this room here is one of the founders of one of the most important funds and rating services, and they play an important role. But their role is not through the market. Their role is to challenge companies' reputation, to make them feel vulnerable, to give them a sense of that these are things which they should care about and responsive to. So we don't need to rely on consumers to encourage companies to behave more responsibly. There are many other very effective vehicles. I think these rating services, I think these disclosure services, I think codes of conduct. I think there are multiple ways in which we can pressure companies. So the question is, could rating help? Yeah, not so much, but ratings would help. A multiplicity of ratings, a multiplicity of pressures, and they can be inconsistent with each other. One advantage of this is that you don't have to worry about fees, because these are essentially voluntary efforts, and they can and some of them can be democratic, some cannot be democratic, et cetera. I think one of the things, comments made someone earlier which disturbed me was the notion, well, a lot of people care about global public health, but the drug companies, they don't. I think that's really unfair. I think companies have values. They care about reputation. There are a lot of things companies do whose bottom line impact is ambiguous, unclear. There are a lot of things companies do as a form of risk insurance to avoid negative reputation, preventive activity to make them better. There's impacts of employee morale. To see companies as narrow-minded, focused, profit-making institutions in which every little decision they make has a bottom-line dimension is, I think, to misunderstand the way corporate America works. I think obviously they are driven by profit goals, but within those frameworks, there's a lot of flexibility and a lot of play. And so I do think that the way to improve global corporate health performance is to use a multiplicity of mechanisms to pressure companies, to monitor companies, to rate them, to compare them with each other. These can be inconsistent or whatever. I think keeping that pressure on companies is very, very important. And finally, let me suggest, I think someone who's followed corporate responsibility, I think one encouraging thing I've learned at this conference is when you're going to focus on global corporate responsibility, don't do it generally, focus on a sector. So I like the idea of focusing on the pharmaceutical sector. That has a big impact. Or focusing on other sectors and their health impact. You need to sort of focus it, narrow it down, focus on specific dimensions. And there I think we have found many, as I suggested, I think many improvements in corporate performance over the last 15, 20 years, including in areas of public health. Most drug companies, for example, now devote a share of their research and development budgets and marketing budgets and distribution budgets to deal with drug issues, health issues in developing countries where people cannot afford them. We can increase that, we can challenge that. But I do think that there are many reasons to suggest that companies are vulnerable to these pressures, and we should do everything possible to increase those pressures on those companies and change the way in which they look at their self-interest so that they take our values into consideration. But I think relying on consumers and consumer labels as the vehicle for driving those improvements in performance will only be very frustrating. Thank you.
So we have about 30 minutes for discussion and Q&A. Anyone want to start us off? Nicole.
Thank you. So I like the plurality. I'm not going to object to that. But I have a question for Nir. I like the way that it's moving, the idea, to let people, if you're going to have some kind of democratic voting system, to let people redistribute their votes sort of infinitely. But I guess I still have a couple of general concerns. And so one is that there's two components. First, it's what do you care about, right? A value question. When we say, how good is this rating system? Well, is it measuring the thing that I care about? And then second is the question of how well does it measure that? And surely you need different levels of expertise to evaluate different rating systems. But that value question is one that it doesn't strike me as, when you attribute it to a single person or something, is going to necessarily be, get you to the right answer, I guess. And then I guess if you do it this way, there's a question of what's the right way to look at the expertise. So academics are really picky. Right? We can critique each other endlessly, and you're never going to get to action in a way. You might have a good metric that's very rigorous in certain scientific methodology. How rigorous does it have to be to make a good rating system? And I'm not sure that the best expert in the world on cost effectiveness analysis is really the person that we want to have evaluate, say, my rating system, though certainly that person seems to me a lot better place to do it than some random Joe on the street, of course. So I don't know, I'm just interested in your thoughts on this.
So I'll say two things. One is that my hope, and if this could work, the hope is, what I'm envisaging is something as follows. People send it to somebody whom they trust as a reliable, so we inform them about the dangers of this being captured by commercial interests and things like that, and they would send it, where they're not even in the profession, they would send it to somebody they trust, who is a famous doctor, And the thought is, typically a famous doctor, and the thought is that that's what I kind of started the day pronouncing. In this area, there is actually, in the area of global health, there's a surprising amount of consensus between different political parties, etc., as compared to, say, our approaches to social justice or to whether global warming exists or whatever. If you try to ask the public, thank you, no. So the thought is it kind of starts out in an okay place, and then it proceeds from the expert to the better expert, etc. Secondly, about I thought that maybe I'll say, I thought at one point that you're going to say, you know, one of the things that people who are not experts lack is the understanding that they're not experts. So maybe the worry was they're going to cast the vote a little too fast. And if so, there could be an interesting, it made me think that could be an interesting correction. People don't have the prerogative to just cast a vote. So they only have the prerogative to delegate it, and you only get the prerogative authority to directly vote when a certain number of users are behind you. So it's just going to be impossible for the Joe Schmo just to kind of vote on things in that way. Otherwise, I'm hoping they would send it in the right direction if it's the case that statistically people tend to be right on the question who is a bigger expert in that particular area than they are, then this is going to progress in the right direction, and after many moves, it will typically, not always, get us to a big expert in the specialized area.
Can I follow up really quickly? So I felt like my question didn't come through. So I'm worried that my methodology might be perfect, but somebody thinks it's for the wrong purpose. So no matter how good of an expert you are in cost effectiveness analysis or something, you might still think this is just totally misguided and we should be focusing on transparency. So there's the value judgment involved as well.
So I did have that in my mind, and the thought was, you know, even if people have kind of pretty silly values or pretty silly kind of first order views about what should be happening in that particular area, superstitions about, who knows. I'm hoping that the decision about who counts as an expert here, who is trustworthy in this area, is not necessarily going to be beholden to these values. So the thought is, I love the people who would, when, you know, asked, say, oh yeah, this guy, he's a doctor, he's kind of good, would be people who would be much worse epistemologically for the decision what should happen in that area. So that's the thinking.
So can I just follow up? So I was trying to envisage what this would look like. I think it's a really fascinating idea, and I have a worry that where the votes would end up. So let's imagine that it has something to do with the global health impact of a food company, and there are a lot of people who blog in relation to food. And so they develop a reputation in the public sphere as being people who know something about food. Now they may have all sorts of conflicts of interest that we don't know about, because, you know, they may receive batches of free products from manufacturers or other stores. And so then what happens is you end up with the same problem. You have the decision maker or the voice of authority already conflicted, and the people who are giving the votes aren't in a position to know that that person is conflicted.
So Sanjay Gupta is going to get packages of free Coke and things like that. I want to think about that.
Two questions, one for Reshma and the second one for David. So first, to Reshma, thanks very much for a really interesting presentation, and congratulations on developing the scorecard, which has clearly looks like it's clearly had some effect. A very simple question. I'm wondering if schools of public health are ever included. If not, why not? And do you think they should be? My question for David, it's actually a question for the whole panel, but I think your comments really raised this question in my mind, which was regarding the concluding questions, I guess, of the day. Can rating systems help? And I think the simple answer to that is yes, they can help, as you said, and that I do believe that it's possible to change company behavior, and that there are many companies who want to do socially progressive and expected things. There are also, however, moments when what is socially desirable or what would be in the best interests of public health or global health or health in a particularly disadvantaged community may go completely against the business model of a company or an industry. May be so fundamentally counter to the requirement, in fact, to earn a profit, that a rating system is not going to work and that you really need government regulation at that point. And I'm just wondering if you, I would be very interested in hearing your thoughts. Where is that line? And to what extent do we see it? So when is it that a rating system will be absolutely inadequate? And if one is put on the table, it can be more of a distraction than a helpful tool.
I agree with you. There are times when the business model itself is inherently irresponsible. But I think that line is not always so straightforward, and it can change over time. So you can imagine a company, take, for example, the oil companies, okay, the energy companies, okay. So, the core argument was, 10, 15 years ago, that relying on fossil fuels, oil, is a business model which inherently is destroying the planet. Okay, fine. Okay, and that was a fair point. Okay, so now we see, of course, these oil companies, first of all, moving into natural gas, which is much less carbon intensive. We now see even the companies, the most recalcitrant companies like ExxonMobil, moving into alternative energy. Okay, so basically, the line, which was very vivid and clear 10, 15 years ago, has changed. Their business models are changing, and one can imagine ExxonMobil, 25 years down the line, basically with oil being a fairly small portion of its revenue base, and yet still as profit-focused as it is now. So I think we see this, in the food industry with organic food. Suddenly, there's real markets in organic food, and we have lots of companies which are developing organic labeled food. And there's again a market which didn't exist. So if you'd asked a company 20 years ago, start to make healthier food products, they would say that undermines our business model. And now we have organic food, and we have natural ingredients as L'Oreal takes over the Body Shop, and the market, what's profitable can shift.
For the oil industry,
I'll just give you an example.
Was it ratings that made them shift their business
No,
model?
no,
Or
I
was
don't
it
think.
Regulation, the threat of regulation.
No, I think their shift has been primarily driven by just normal business logic. But I think there are other cases in which companies have shifted their focus for reputation reasons. But I agree. I think the market remains critical. But the market can be more flexible than we might have thought sometimes. But yeah, I would certainly agree that there are real constraints, and then we need regulation, of course.
Can I just respond to the example you gave of organic food in the food industry? I think the food industry has now recognized that promoting foods for their purported health benefits is a real winner, and they can do that while making profits. For example, the chocolate companies recognize now you just put the chocolate in smaller pieces in fancier wrappers and individual portions, and people will pay more per ounce of chocolate than they did before. And there's a lot of food which isn't necessarily healthy or better for you that they are promoting in such a way as to make consumers believe that. So now the goalposts are always moving because gradually consumers become more savvy. But the point is that my own feeling is without some more effective regulation, there's a time lag in which people are being deceived.
Look, I couldn't agree more, and I've spent much of my professional life over the last decade criticizing people who believe that enlightened self-interest through the marketplace will address our problems in a serious way. I could not agree with you more.
To your first question, so we haven't graded schools of public health for two reasons. One, we primarily looked on impacts on clinical behavior, so prescribing practices, what drugs are included in formularies, et cetera. The second part is actually because there's a lot of contention in the academic community about what's a research conflict of interest, which is where we see problems at public health schools and university institutions and deciding what's correct and what's not. Because there's a lot of a lot of value put on the use of industry and partnering with academic centers in promoting research, and that line is becoming more and more blurred. And I expect the next iteration of the scorecard to include a lot more on research conflicts of interest, which would encompass public health schools, also university-wide systems. The only kind of guidelines that have been set out so far is by the American Association of University Professors, which put out this 200-page document about recommendations for what a research conflict of interest document should look like. But even then, it has a lot of exceptions. It has a lot of vagueness in terms of faculty members getting paid to be speakers for or consultants for research for pharmaceutical companies, and what that payment looks like, and the caps and the number of events that they are speaking to. So there's a lot of contention on that. Actually, to your the second question, I was wondering about actually the health impact scorecard. In New England Journal of Medicine, Hans Horstgill, who published about the health assessment scorecard, there was no conflicts of interest actually reported in his disclosure. And the companies, if you look over the years, look like they've done increasingly well. And it doesn't take into consideration Foreign Corrupt Practices Act violations, False Claims Act violations. GlaxoSmithKline looks like it did incredibly well in terms of their corporate social responsibility measures / how much global health impact they've put out. But if you put in that $3 billion charge that they had last year, I wonder how much the rating would shift. And that was something that was not even mentioned in that New England Journal of Medicine article, which was particularly striking to a lot of us who've been looking at these cases in the past years.
I also thought up that there's a slightly different model in the GiveWell example of how you would, two thoughts. So first is, it seems like label initiatives come out of a need for self-regulation. So I'm wondering if you know anything about how the fair trade sort of trans fair mega labels came about. But that's my sense. And then second is, GiveWell has a way of monitoring itself, which is it makes itself available for external review to people interested in looking at their ratings. And that's something that might be a model for that if you feel like the need is for some kind of external review of these labeling systems. So I guess I'm sort of interested in what's motivating you to think we need this, what other models might there be, and if you have any thoughts on the GiveWell model.
Well, we're lucky with GiveWell. Who says we'll be lucky with any labeler in this area?
I guess I don't think we're lucky with GiveWell, but do you mean that they won't make themselves available for external review, or do you mean that they won't do a good job, or?
Oh, so maybe I didn't understand the question. I thought that the suggestion was, why can't we just kind of settle for something? So GiveWell is a labeler of charities. It's a second order thing. Why can't we? Maybe I didn't understand the question. I thought that you're defending the label model. Maybe I didn't understand it.
Yeah, sorry, maybe I wasn't clear. So my question is, why do we need a label of labels? That's the first question. There seems to be a problem of reliability or something. So one thing GiveWell does to make sure its ratings are reliable is it provides information to anyone who wants to be an external reviewer, maybe they vet these in some way, about how they came up with their ratings, and then they say you can be an external reviewer. So one thing labels could do would be open themselves up to that kind of external review if that's the concern. But that might not be your concern about why you think that we need mega labels or something like that, or a review system. And then I'm wondering what your concern is, and if there's other models like fair trade's mega labeling thing, if you know anything about why those came about, that would be interesting as well.
It's interesting. So in GiveWell, which is, by the way, if you guys are kind of looking for recommendations, it's not just that they say much more than these are, at the end of the day, the 3 most recommended charities. There are other charities. If you have a taste for something, you will find, each of you will find something for your taste if you need recommendations at this season of giving. And they do operate very rigorous standards compared to what is otherwise out there. GiveWell do, for all of their meetings are basically, you can find podcasts on the web with those. It's very transparent in that way, and does give me a lot of assurance. And the question is, why can't we achieve the credibility about kind of lack of conflict through something like that extreme level of transparency? It's an interesting option. I bet there are things that you could still hide that happen outside the meetings, but I don't know, something to consider.
I'll ask a question. Nir, how do these two things map together? So your label, the labeler idea, and then if I remember correctly, Rainforest Alliance actually is an accreditation system that accredits certifiers. And some of those certifiers, I think, have labels. So there's something like Greenwood or something like that. Is there anything that you could learn from an accreditation that sort of grades the certifier? Is that a parallel system or somehow?
That would be
related?
I didn't distinguish, I didn't, for my purposes, distinguish between whether it's kind of the form of rating or the form of yes, no for accreditation or things of that sort, but it's something about, something assessing the something is the second order thing that I talked about. And all I said was this could be part of the solution, but it's not enough because the uppermost something could also be the something that accredits the something that accredits. Still, there could be problems here as well. So we need to do more work, and then I proceeded to thinking about how we can kind of make that one really, really reliable and good.
Again, I'm Lawrence Tai, a fellow at the Center for Ethics at Harvard. For Nir, so for your label of labels, you discussed a lot about the possibility that one label might be conflicted versus another. I was wondering if you could speak to a different problem when maybe the nature of the actual global health challenge isn't clear, where the labels might actually be truthful, but it's not necessarily clear that purchasing such an item would actually improve global health. I don't have an example in that arena off the top of my head because it's not my area, but I would take from the environment, right? Hybrid cars, right? Hybrid cars,
yeah.
or electric engines, right? They save on gasoline, but supposedly recycling the battery has a large environmental burden that's separate from that. And I was wondering how your label for labels would tease apart, not necessarily self-interested attempts to corrupt the labels, but genuine questions about how to solve what I think are difficult global health challenges.
So that's what I cataloged as the problem of incompetence or kind of silly labels. So you can make mistakes in many ways. So sometimes it's because you have not the right motivation. That's when it's corrupt. Sometimes it's because you use the wrong standard or the wrong metric, or you're just not very good at measuring, or problems of that sort. So if indeed it's a problem, I didn't know that about hybrid cars. If indeed it's a problem, all things considered, it makes them kind of worse for the environment than non-hybrid cars, then that would come under some form of incompetence. And what I would say about those things is that's all the more reason to want the biggest experts in the field. And by expert, by the way, I don't mean in the sense of the person sitting in Geneva. It could also be they're the biggest expert and the best position to know because they talk a lot to the communities or anything that makes them really epistemologically best positioned to tell. That's one more reason why we want the system to be good, to have maximal competence behind the setting of the labels.
Okay, so I think we're going to spend the last 13 minutes talking about next steps, a summary of what we've discussed, and if we want to do anything in the future. So Nir, I'll turn to you to kick that off.
Oh, really? Ooh, okay. Okay, then we say it was, okay.
Did you want me to do it?
I thought so, no? Well, should we do it together? Yes.
Sure. You can start.
So we had, it's basically where we're opening this to your input. So we've had discussions today of a notion that many of us feel holds some promise. If it's kind of some mechanism, if it's done well, it could be potentially a big force for change and for improvement in the arena of global health. There are a lot of resources in global capital, a lot of potential for damage that if it could be preempted, that would have a huge impact in itself. It also has all those pitfalls that we discussed and we should continue to discuss. We want this to be the beginning of some more thinking about this, more attempts to interest the wider public. We are creating a website that will have the videos from today we are going to place there, the kind of little video clip that we started the day with. Other materials, if you will, we already sent you an email calling on you to send in articles by yourself, articles by others, web addresses of organizations that you think are interesting. We're going to try to create there a web page with a lot of interesting stuff for people to check out if they are academics interested in this, if they're members of the wider public, if they are labeling organizations interested in inching a little towards kind of the sort of things that we thought today would be valuable. And any resource that you deem valuable in that respect, we will consider. So we'll send you another email about the kind of with a Dropbox address to kind of dump things into. We wonder if we want to do more. People threw out, ideas of maybe an edited volume, maybe not. It's a almost unmanageably interdisciplinary enterprise that we've had it today, and maybe nothing that any publishing house could stomach. Maybe not. Maybe I thought that a lot of the presentations were very interesting, and maybe we could do things like that. Maybe you have other ideas for stuff we could do. We're interested in your input.
Picking up on some of the things that David Vogel said and Swearing Moon said, and reflecting on the fact that already there is a lot of progress being made on disclosure and rating systems and certification systems. I think one of the sort of storylines of corporate social responsibility for the last 130 years has been this balance, finding the balance between government regulation and free markets. And I think that in the context of today, with a lot of emphasis being placed both on increased support for strong government and the battle over government and the strength of government, and the whole question of what kind of contributions corporations can be made about that. One of the things that is, I think, not being thought about quite enough is under what circumstances is it appropriate for government, and under what circumstances is it appropriate for corporations to act or to have the power to act.
Lawrence.
I guess one thing that just comes to mind is you might actually have a catalog of actual rating systems that are already out there, just to make it more concrete. Not just the ones that were discussed by presenters today, but just ones that have been out there, to get a sense of, so that people can maybe get a more intuitive feel of the challenges that there are with this issue.
Yeah, I'd like to propose, obviously there are systems out there, multiple careers. My first one was as an investment analyst and rating mutual funds. So we look at things like Morningstar, Standard & Poor's, et cetera, those kind of ratings. They hold a lot of sway, obviously, in the investment world. I think we could begin at least some sort of rating system, actually, right here, at Harvard, starting to look at, we could base it off of, medical schools. That's one idea. You could even rate schools of public health. And again, there's ratings we could base off of hypocrisy, relative to best practices, and I think students would be phenomenally interested in that. That'd be kind of cool to do, get the inside honest scoop from students who are not corrupt, I think that'd be exciting for students to do and would motivate professors to get a little more honest and move things forward, shall we say. And that's practical. I mean, and in fact, it's I think it's unique to what you're doing, Reshma, particularly because it's something that I don't think any other organization could do. It's mainly medical students, I think, that could really do that, or students in schools of public health could pressure their own professors, their corrupt doctor professors. They know they're corrupt, but they can't really tell them to their face because, then they get all hell. So anyway, I've talked to medical students about that. And it's a big problem. They feel helpless in the whole situation. It's only your organization that could do something like that. So you could start ratings, and the key is to start, just to start, get some ideas going. And I know there's so much complexity that's been discussed today, but just get some basic guidelines going and just start with the process. As far as where you're saying, we could have a system, for example, with certain corporations. Let's start with the food sector. All right, I mean, we know that there's a huge, huge burden in terms of global public health in the U.S. and globally, and fast food corporations, for one, start rating them, or just any other food corporate, even industries. You could take a look at specific industries and their contribution. I mean, we know for a fact, even from environmentalism and from global, red meat and tobacco just should be largely taken out as much as we can. I mean, this is old news, not new news. The public is still confused about red meat, thanks to a lot of industry campaigns, but this should just, Dr. Willett's gotten really clear about it. He had a nice article done on Boston Globe and, pointed out, he was pretty firm on the idea, no one really should be eating this when you really look at the data in the big picture, environmentally, and every metric of public health. So we could start doing these kind of ratings, and it may not be perfect, but you got to start somewhere. And I would suggest that, ethically speaking, it behooves us to say that having some rating system that a lot of experts here at Harvard could agree upon, in a multidisciplinary approach, would be better than not doing something or just simply having more discussions for another 3 years. So just to throw that out to you, kind of to take some, leadership initiative. I'd be happy to, work with any of you on that as well.
I think you'd be reinventing the wheel. We have scores of criteria already. We have scores of social investment funds, each of which have their own criteria. We have enormous amount of ratings. You don't have to start from scratch. We have numerous ratings of companies out there. And there's a magazine we see, Ethical Corporation. Every year it lists the 100 most ethical companies in the world. We have ratings of the 100 most greenest companies in the world, best companies for women to work for, best family-friendly companies. I mean, there is scores and scores of corporate ratings. Just use any of the ones that you want. You don't have to create your own.
That's a good point. I'm aware that part of the problem there is the majority of consumers, frankly, and majority of politicians, majority of people, decision makers, and lots of decision power don't even know these ratings exist. Frankly, I mean, I've heard a lot of this, but a lot are not even aware of. Certainly, most consumers are not aware of it. That's for sure. So we could, but it could be an aggregation site, like at Harvard, and say here are here's how this one, kind of an aggregator, kind of a score of scores, so to speak. And that contains a lot of value. You might say, well, what's the point of that? Okay. Well, the point is you have one centralized website, so to speak, right? That effectively consumers go to one website, and it's by Harvard, right? There you go. Okay, so it's like the World Health Organization. You get credibility. That's a big deal, and it doesn't waste people's time. You have high information density, high credibility density, if you will, and people go there and they said, okay, here's top ratings, put by the Safra Center, et cetera, and it's a start. We aggregate other scores, like you said, that are out there, and you can kind of create a score of scores, just an idea.
I just think, just fine. I think the evidence that any group of consumers, including members at Harvard, are going to respond is extremely thin.
I mean, I guess one thing, piggybacking off of what you were saying, is even there are ratings out there. There are ones that are well publicized compared to others, and consumers pay attention to them based on how much exposure they have. And the example I brought up earlier with the Access to Medicine Index, like that has been lauded in the medical community so much. And if it would be really interesting, because these other stories about patients dying as a result of misleading marketing get attention, if you incorporated that into an already existing scorecard, or made some sort of assessment on different types of scorecard for a particular sector, I think that would have a lot of impact, especially in looking at research that's publicly available. All these cases are out there. The amount of settlements, the charges are all out there. Some of the research I do is on the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. If you just looked at that in comparison to these companies that are being rated, it'd be a great way to kind of adjust the ratings for something that might be a true rating after, and a way to assess what these rating systems actually look like.
Sure. One quick question on that. Have you thought of rating pharmaceutical companies, like just rating big pharma in terms of, there's a big thing on TED, obviously, that half the data is being deleted in a lot of the randomized controlled trials, not only is it biased or rigged, but...
Moderators, privilege. I rate the pharmaceutical companies on that issue, the missing and misleading information.
We actually had a student who did a master's thesis on the Access to Medicine Index and actually attempted to readjust the ratings based on the False Claims Act and FCPA, and presented this to Open Society Foundations. And it was striking to see how different the ratings would be. And the work I'm doing now is actually looking to see if the FCPA is actually curbing pharmaceutical behavior in comparison to other rating systems, and it hasn't.
Okay, so I think we're going to move towards dinner. The schedule says dinner's at 7, but for the speakers and those invited, we'll just head on over straight away. So wanted to thank our sponsors. We have 6 of them. The Division of Medical Ethics at the Harvard Medical School, the Petrie Flom Center for Health, Law, Biotechnology, and Bioethics in the law school, the Kamen Fund, the Harvard Global Health Institute, the Harvard University Program in Ethics and Health, and the Edmund J. Safra Center for Ethics. And in terms of people, we owe thanks to many individuals. All of our session chairs, Dan Brock, Glenn Cohen, Glaudine Niene, Dan Wickler, Bob Trug, Katie Pritchard Evans, without whom we couldn't have done any of this. Also at Safra, Joe Hollow and Stephanie Dent, Helena Martins, and our photographer, Martha Stewart, who I think fled, Molly Hudson, and the team at the Joseph B. Martin Conference Center, Scott McCauley, and the media services team, who've been here all day. At the Global Health Institute, apart from Sue and Glaudine, Emily Robinson and Edna Liquidano at Petrie Flom, Chrissy Hutchinson-Jones, and Holly Fernandez-Lynch. And at the Program of Ethics, we already mentioned Dan Wickler. Carol Maglita for her help with the graphic design that we've been enjoying all day, the global footprint, and Karen Beck for the web design, the team at the Draw Shop who helped produce this morning's animation clip, and David Langlios at the Harvard Law School, and Ed Visner who helped put together the video interview with John Ruggie, and Nir, who actually had the inspiration for this conference. And I think that's everyone.
And you,
Jennifer.
And Jennifer as well, the co-organizer.